The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for the coronavirus, but it's manipulating the global media to paint itself as the world's savior. Is it working? This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. If you want to know how China affects your life, be sure to subscribe. And check back every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday for new episodes. We found out YouTube is not sending out notifications to all subscribers, and actually secretly unsubscribing people from the show. So, yeah, check back frequently. So you might be wondering how 2020 became the year of cowering in your homes while fighting your neighbors for toilet paper. Well, the answer is the Chinese Communist Party. It's been very well documented that they knew about the coronavirus early and covered it up. They hoarded medical supplies and got the World Health Organization to downplay how serious the disease was. That's why I call the coronavirus the CCP virus. Put the blame where the blame is due, right? Well, the Chinese Communist Party is the master of propaganda. They're spinning a false narrative that they actually saved the world. And they've gotten a lot of Western media to buy into the lies. Joining me today is Joshua Philipp, senior investigative reporter at Epoch Times and host of the TV show Crossroads. Thanks for joining me, Josh.
It's a real pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, how has the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda narrative changed over the course of the coronavirus?
The Chinese regime has gone through several different phases of its propaganda push. Of course, it started off by saying there's no problem in China, we have the whole thing under control, there's no human-to-human transmission, nothing to be concerned about. If you put travel bans on China, you're racist. If you try to say that we're not handling it well, you're spreading misinformation and causing panic. Then, of course, it turned out that they were censoring people who tried warning the rest of the world about it. The fact that they did that turned into a scandal. And so when the scandal came out, when it started spreading around the world, they changed their narrative. And what did they say? They said that the Chinese regime itself was not responsible for it. The virus came from America, not from China. They shifted the blame, right? And they said that they started calling it the USA virus. They came up with this propaganda narrative saying that maybe the American military brought it to China during the October 2019 war games in Wuhan, right? And then they called it the USA virus. Then they said, oh, it came from Italy. It's the Italian virus. Now they're saying it's the French virus from France. Then they shifted the propaganda narrative again. And they started saying that what we need is, international harmony. We need cooperation. We need US-China cooperation. And they played up this whole harmonious, we are the world type narrative. And now they're shifting it again, now that different countries are calling for investigations into the Chinese regime and, its handling of the virus, into the WHO for its ties to the Chinese regime, and also into the origin of the virus. It's not just the US calling for this, but a lot of countries, including most of Europe right now, Australia, of course, the US and others. And so it has been changing the narrative when it comes to this disinformation and propaganda campaign, basically going by what the rest of the world is saying. And it does appear that they're losing this battle on many fronts. And of course, when we say propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation are of course different. And the CCP is using a blend of all of these.
Well, I know another big propaganda narrative they've been pushing is that China bought the world time, but the US blew it. They botched it. I think that's an important one to also bring up.
Yeah, that's a big one they're doing right now too. So the CCP has been put in the latest campaign they're launching. For example, Xinhua News, which is of course state-run media, one of the Chinese regime's main state-run news outlets, now currently listed as a foreign mission of the Chinese regime under the State Department, which means it's not only just a foreign agent, under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, which it was before, but it is now listed as a foreign mission. In other words, basically a branch of the Chinese regime. It's a media, but it's considered a branch of the Chinese government itself. They put out these different viral type videos where it's like a Lego puppet show looking thing. And they have the Lego representing China saying things like, oh, we're dealing with this virus. And they have one representing the USA saying, oh, it's nothing but a flu. Oh, there's nothing to worry about. Oh, no, now we're getting the virus. And of course, they paint the Chinese regime as being the sensible voice in that, and the US one as being the irrational voice in that. And of course, reacting to it. Now, when it comes down to how this whole thing is played out, the FCC chair actually had a great Twitter thread, which I went over in one of my episodes on Crossroads, and he really breaks down the different points the regime has made on that. And I won't go over the entire thing here, but essentially here's what it said. The CCP is basically using disinformation. And there are, of course, many different types of disinformation. But when you get into it, I'd say on the deeper end of it goes into the footnotes of narratives. And so when you're dealing with this propaganda campaign the CCP has launched, what are the footnotes? The footnotes are how the regime itself played out its propaganda. Under the Chinese regime's footnotes, there was no such thing as the Chinese regime arresting doctors. There was no such thing as them disappearing journalists. There was no such thing as them, lying, for example, about the fact that, there was human to human transmission, and allowed people in China to travel abroad, and even criticized countries for banning travel from China. Notably, after the Chinese regime itself had banned, for example, internal travel from Wuhan. They were still letting these people go abroad. In the Chinese regime's narratives, none of that happened. And so they're basing their arguments on a limited scope of information, and they're building narratives on top of that limited scope of information. They're presenting a false picture of the situation that took place, and using that false picture as the footnotes to build additional arguments. And so if people have not been exposed to the actual context, it does seem that their narratives are reasonable. And this is how the regime is playing this out right now.
Well, I know you are an expert on disinformation. How does it really work? Because, the Chinese Communist Party has been doing all of these different propaganda lines. Is it because one isn't working and those they have to do something else? Or is that all part of how disinformation works?
So let's look a bit at, first of all, the institutions and then how these things are defined. So for the Chinese regime, they have adopted into the Chinese regime's military doctrine is the three warfares concept. In other words, a propaganda disinformation system based on three different areas. One is legal warfare, the manipulation of international legal systems; media warfare, the control of outlets of information, not just news outlets, but social media, any kind of forum where people could communicate would be targeted through it. And there's also psychological warfare. And psychological warfare is not necessarily lying on the surface. Psychological warfare is using any means to alter the way people perceive information, so that you and I could be looking at the same set of information. We could be looking at the same collection of facts and come to wildly different conclusions based on those. That is the purpose of psychological warfare. So, for example, when it comes to this virus, we have three different elements of it: media warfare, legal warfare, psychological warfare. The legal warfare is, of course, the battle over who can be held responsible over this. Many countries, including the United States, are threatening legal action against China. And of course, even class action lawsuits at different places that aren't necessarily being done by countries, but they're being done by individuals. That is a legal warfare element. The Chinese regime is saying, first off, that you cannot sue us. And second off, it's saying, well, how about we sue you back? And of course, in China, where they have these state-run kangaroo courts, they can do whatever they want. Of course, if they challenge anything within Chinese, the Chinese court system, they can do whatever they want. The second one, being media warfare, would be the control of outlets of information. And of course, the CCP does have its state-run media. It also has foreign experts it can send for interviews in major foreign news outlets who appear to be independent and, respectable, but are really just a lot of times parroting the CCP. And of course, then there's the psychological warfare, which in this case would be the narrative, the alteration of the narrative. In other words, do you perceive the Chinese regime as having been responsible, having handled this virus outbreak well? of, having, say, taken precautions that other countries did not when it comes to handling it? And do you see them as having, for example, warned the world as opposed to, covering up information from the world? Within the Chinese regime's spectrum of information that they've presented, that is the picture they're trying to present. But if you, of course, like you and I have been following the entire breadth of information, you can see right through it. We know that the Chinese regime is, of course, manipulating courts, manipulating news outlets, at least the outlets of information. And we know the Chinese regime is basing its arguments on incomplete information. And of course, if you know the Chinese regime's different forms of cover-up, you know that they, did not alert the world of what was happening. Quite the opposite. They were lying to the world about what was happening. They were covering up information. They were arresting doctors. They were disappearing journalists. That would be, again, breaking it down, three warfare's doctrine. The CCP has other branches for this. Of course, propaganda department, the official one, 50-cent army of internet trolls. And when it comes to the political realm, they have, for example, the liaison department, which is it operates under the general political department, which is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military. And so when it comes to influencing politicians, the realm of politics, they use the liaison department for that. They also have different networks for high-level influence, two of them, in fact, at least. One of them being the Committee of 100, which is a group of high-level influencers in the United States, for example, who can write op-eds in news outlets, who can write, papers and so on, and defend the Chinese regime's positions. They also have the United Front Work Department, which operates through its consulates in different countries, a lot of times through from the consulates, managing through the Chinese Tongs or hometown associations, which can work as the grassroots voices of the regime in different parts of the world. And so they maintain this entire very large system guided by different forms of policies and, of course, state controls. But when we get into the deeper picture of disinformation, propaganda, and misinformation, a lot of media, understandably, of course, a lot of media use these words interchangeably without actually understanding the nuances between them. Propaganda is not necessarily a lie. Propaganda is meant to cause an emotional reaction. You can think of it as like a Pavlov's dog effect, an unconscious reaction to a stimuli. And so the stimuli can be a country. A stimuli could be a race of people. A stimuli could be, the CCP itself. Basically, how do you react when you hear or see something? And of course, propaganda can make you feel patriotism. It can make you feel hatred. It can make you feel, like someone has been wronged or dishonored. Of course, there's propaganda posters during wartime meant to make you feel, support for your country and hatred towards an enemy. There are many uses of propaganda. Again, and there's also, when you get into communist tactics, they talk about agitation propaganda. In other words, ways of agitating you emotionally and teaching you to associate that emotional agitation with a political issue, with a targeted party enemy, and so on. The Chinese regime uses all of this.
Well, speaking of emotional agitation, what role has American media played in this? Have they been helping the American population see what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, or have they played into it?
The media reaction in the U.S. has unfortunately, in my opinion, very much aligned itself with the Chinese regime on many issues. They have been critical of the CCP in some regards, but I think we're facing a very unfortunate situation on two fronts. One being that this issue has been politicized. The virus has been politicized. And a lot of news organizations, whether it's them or the parent companies, which are usually these big multinational corporations, they of course want to defend these global institutions like the WHO. A lot of the social media, for example, YouTube, the head of YouTube came out and announced that they would be deleting videos that go against WHO recommendations. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook came out with statements saying that they would of course be fighting misinformation around the virus. NBC had an article saying that part of that battle against what they consider misinformation being just the outright statement of false information. at least as they perceive it, that they would be directing people to the WHO for accurate, quote unquote information. And of course, when it comes to this issue being politicized, unfortunately, one of the scandals being used right now by a lot of the outlets that, of course, associate themselves with political agendas is that Trump is being criticized of having mishandled the virus. And of course, that's one of the big political talking points. And so when the Chinese regime has been using a lot of the media reports about that for its own propaganda. And of course, a lot of different countries, when the Chinese regime comes out and supports that narrative, they of course quote it because it serves their agenda as well, at least it seems. And so you have seen a lot of that. At the same time, because there is such huge pushback against the CCP, some outlets actually, in addition to that, have come out and criticized the Chinese regime and have criticized what it did. But it's mixed. It does seem to be that is changing right now, especially as countries call for investigations into the origin of this virus. They seem to be aligning themselves more with the Chinese regime and the WHO than with the idea that there should be, say, independent investigations into this and to try to figure out what's really going on.
Well, so how successful has the Communist Party's propaganda narrative been? Earlier you said it seemed like it wasn't working, but based on what you just said, it sounds like it's going very well.
It's mixed. The Chinese regime is pretty much mobilizing its entire force of controlled institutions, of different voices that it has, like the 50 Cent Army and stuff. But they've pushed it so hard that it's becoming obvious. And a lot of people are, despite the propaganda, despite the narratives, despite all of this mobilization of all the, Chinese regime's foreign forces, people are seeing through it. It's actually incredible to see. And even a lot of different countries' leaders now that were previously a lot of times very favorable to the CCP, such as in the UK, such as in Australia, they're coming out now and calling out the Chinese regime. And it seems they're no longer afraid to do so. And when the CCP has come back and threatened them, now I think the Chinese regime, believed it had more control than it did when it comes down to it. And they're seeing that when they come out and do that, even though within their own country things like that might work, when it comes to the international community, it has the opposite effect. If you come out and threaten someone for speaking bad about you, not even speaking bad a lot of times, just for, say, calling for independent investigations, and they come out and attack them, it's had the opposite effect. And not only just the grassroots individual people of different countries are starting to see through it, but even a lot of state leaders are starting to see through it and call it out. And so I'd say even though the regime has been very, very aggressive on this and is launching very large-scale campaigns of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, a lot of people see through it. Can't say everyone sees through it, but a lot of them do.
What's at stake for the Communist Party if it can't control the narrative about the coronavirus?
Right, so of course, Chris, I had you on my show just recently, Crossroads, and we talked about this a little bit. And one of the things I mentioned, which I'll go into a bit more here, is that really when it comes down to it, when you boil it down, there are two international battles right now, at least from the standpoint of the CCP. There's the battle of the institutions. There's the battle for who controls, say, businesses and doing hostile takeovers of companies, using foreign direct investment when the global economy is destabilized. There's the control over institutions such as the United Nations or, say influence over the institutions, United Nations, WHO, others. There's the control and influence over global media, not always direct control, but sometimes just say having a Chinese academic go and, write an op-ed or do an interview with them that presents the CCP's issues as if it were coming from a grassroots voice. There's this large-scale system of control, and it does seem that the CCP not only has strong control over that, but can use the virus to expand that. For example, One Belt, One Road, foreign direct investment, it is being called out in some countries, but when it comes to, say, Latin America, Africa, some parts of Asia, they don't have the ability to stand up to it as much, and so the regime might gain more control in some regards through that. But there's also the battle of narrative, the battle of ideas, the war of perception, right? And really, when it comes down to it, when you're dealing with free countries, everything is directed by perception. Because the basis of independent countries, of free countries, is that the people themselves decide the outcome, right? If they vote for the politicians, they can vote to a large extent for the policies, determining, in terms of who they vote for. Public opinion is what directs a lot of things, and of course, politics are privy to public opinion to a large extent. They have to follow it, at least to a pretty large extent, unless they don't want to get reelected. And so, in other words, the basis of free societies is an informed public making decisions. And so information is a huge, huge part of that. And the Chinese regime is losing the information war because they're pushing so hard and so aggressively that everybody is seeing through it. And even a lot of their narratives are really flimsy. For example, we mentioned these different disinformation campaigns are launching right now. They seem very well formed. They seem very well polished, but they're fragile. And of course, they're being called out left and right. It's not even a partisan issue at this point. You even have a lot of very left-wing countries calling out the CCP. In the U.S., it's become almost a bipartisan issue in a lot of regards, although there are some who do seem to align themselves with it more. But for the most part, it does seem to be bipartisan, that they see the regime for what it is. And so by losing the battle of ideas, they can lose the overall battle. And it does seem that is the direction it's heading in, at least in my analysis.
So after the coronavirus pandemic is done, do you think things will go back to the status quo, or has the international relationship with China changed forever?
I'd say changed forever. And in my opinion, I've been saying it, I don't think the Chinese regime has a good chance of surviving this. And I say that based on a few different points of information. One is, now for the Chinese regime itself, it's a totalitarian system. And what is the basis of that? It's 3 points. One is the internal narrative that the Chinese regime can make better decisions than you can. That to justify its control of what you believe, what you think, what you do in your life, that the regime itself has, your self-interest in mind more so than you do, and is able to make better decisions than you can. That narrative internally in China has been shaken up because a lot of people do not agree with the way the Chinese regime handled this. Although the propaganda coming out right now is saying otherwise, that people are saying, the China handled it the best of any country. We all know how those things are formed, of course. But in Wuhan, we had reports, for example, of people being so angry at the CCP that the only outlet they had was to go out on their porches at night and yell curses at the Chinese regime into the sky. You have people who lost family members and are getting ashes back that do not appear to be the ashes of their family members. You have people who've had family died, been locked in their apartments. You have a lot of rumors spreading around about, who's responsible. You have businesses going out of business because of the lockdowns and because of the measures the CCP took, which brings me into the next two elements of social control in China. One is the idea of fear. And so are you more afraid of the party than, afraid to stand up for your rights? Do you perceive the ability to stand up against it as being more dangerous to your well-being than, say, laying down and just dealing with it? The Chinese people they no longer seem to be afraid of the CCP. And even a lot of local government officials seem to be defying even higher government orders. There's a balkanization taking place even among different Chinese provinces when it comes to how to deal with things. And you see even low-level officials criticizing high-level officials, which you would never see before. I mean, really rarely at least. And then there's the financial element to it. And really, already before this virus took place, that element was being shaken up by the U.S.-China trade war. And even more so now, where businesses are going out, companies, even the ones that have started back up, are having trouble restarting because there's no demand. People aren't buying. They're having trouble getting workers and many other issues. And so things are destabilized across the board for the CCP. And at the same time, you have countries like Japan paying companies to move their businesses outside of China. You have the U.S., different companies pulling out even during the U.S.-China trade war before the virus that was happening. And so that entire manufacturing base in China is pulling out. You have possible sanctions underway against Chinese high-tech industries such as Huawei. You have rumors that the U.S. might, for example, ban the sale of semiconductors to China, which means that the high-tech industry in China is about to go under. You have talk of international lawsuits against the CCP, and one of the ways the Trump administration is floating that as a possibility, because it is hard to sue a country, is they might do it through sanctions. And so the CCP in every single way internally is being destabilized. All they have right now and all they're playing with are the different systems of international control. And a lot of those systems, they're using them to such an extent that they're basically the masks have fallen off and people see them for what they are.
Well, thanks for joining me, Josh. That was very insightful.
Hey, my pleasure, Chris.
And thank you for joining us. You can find Crossroads on YouTube. I was actually interviewed this week by Josh, so I'll have a link to that one below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.